So what we're speaking about today is El Nino. And I think some of us, we've heard of El Nino, but if we're being really honest, we're not exactly sure what it means and we're too embarrassed to ask. So what El Nino means is little boy in Spanish, and the opposite of it is La Niña, which means little girl in Spanish. And they are opposing weather patterns that are seen or they begin in the Pacific Ocean. And the reason that these terms are in Spanish is because all the way back in the 1600s, South American fishermen first started noticing periods of unusually warm water. So the thing that's important to understand is that these weather phenomena are naturally occurring. They're part of climate variability, which means that even if humans didn't exist, they would be happening. But what's important to understand is that anthropogenic climate change is making these weather patterns more complex and more threatening. So La Nina, El Nino, opposing weather patterns, and they happen in 3 to 5 year cycles. So we've just come out of La Nina, little girl, which is in South Africa, a wetter period. And this summer we'll start experiencing El Nino, which is little boy or the dry period. So that's like a very basic summary, but I think I'm going to pass it over to Coleen first, who is an incredible climatologist and who's worked with scientists from across the world to explain a bit further what El Nino is.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you to Julia and to also Leonie. Lovely to be here. And thank you to APSA as well for making this possible. So El Nino, as was explained, is a natural phenomena. It's been occurring for many, many years. In fact, we've got records that go back, to 1500s in South Africa, 1877. So this is not new. It's something that has been in our history for many years. 1982, 83 was a big one. 1997, 98 was another one. 2018 and 2019, and then 2015 and 2016, another big one. So they come in waves, as you heard, normally about 3 to, some people say 7 years, and I think Leonie will be talking about what happens when they come, and then if we're on the back of one and we're going into another phase. But essentially, they are quite complicated. I think most matriculants who are doing geography learn the dreaded diagrams because they are tricky. But it is an ocean warming situation. It's one of the most fascinating and beautiful, if you like, processes that occurs because it's the coupling between the ocean and the atmosphere. So it's a very, very interesting phenomena, first developed many years ago by Gilbert Walker and others. And what happens is that you get warming off in the Pacific, in the central and eastern parts of the Pacific. And because the ocean starts to warm, obviously it has to go somewhere. So it goes into the atmosphere. And then the interesting thing is that it's coupled to the atmosphere. And so the trade winds tend to ferry moisture across to other places. We call these things teleconnections or couplings. And unfortunately, though, for some of us, when this warm, moist air starts to rise into the atmosphere very far away from us, but what goes up must come down. And unfortunately for us in South Africa, some of that air comes down. And when it comes down, it tends to dry out. And so we can get drought periods. As you correctly heard, they are linked to the wetter periods, the La Nina in parts of South Africa, and the drier periods, which we're going into. But the phenomena are really complex. So in 97, 98, everyone was on high alert for an El Nino in South Africa and Mozambique, and it didn't really pan out. So we have to be very careful when we're saying, is one coming and how predictable is it? I think this season coming, we are sure that it is coming. The predictability is fairly high. But the problem in South Africa is where is it going to spatially land and have its impact? So for most of us in South Africa, it normally comes with droughts, particularly in the interior and the northern parts of the country, the western parts. It has a different signature, if you like, in the Western Cape and other areas. And I think Leonie will be talking to that. But if it's a severe one and it's got a high magnitude with, fairly hard hitting, then we can have huge devastation. You can have big losses in food prices, in local livelihoods, in coral reefs in Australia that die off, et cetera, et cetera. So it's something that isn't something that we need to ignore. And before I hand back to you and over to Leonie, one of the interesting things, I think, is that it is known as a creeping phenomena. So when we have flash floods, that's kind of quick and in your face. But with El Niños, you've got a drought coming and it's creeping. So you've got enough time to really get your ducks in a row and your emergency systems on hand. And we can maybe come back to that later. So thanks. That helps you. But if anyone's got access to a computer or Google, a lot has been written about this, and in a very graphic way. There's lots of YouTubes and things you can go and watch if you want to see how the phenomena, this intricate dynamic meteorology really operates. Thanks very much, Julia.
Yeah. Thank you, Coleen. Yeah, I think it's really important. A lot of what I love telling climate skeptics is that, the weather has been changing since the Ice Age. No one is denying that. But the whole point is that climate change is making weather impacts like drought or rainfall, or weather phenomena like El Niño, La Niña, more complex, more threatening, which is why we really need to focus and we really need to prepare. And that's where I want to hand it over to you, Leonie. So how are complex historic factors going to have ripple effects that go well beyond the obvious, like flooding, winds, drought?
Great. So thank you very much. It's wonderful to join all of you. I want to present a couple of case studies today to demonstrate exactly this point, that these events don't happen in isolation. But maybe it's worth starting with a useful metaphor. In the movie Don't Look Up, they describe climate collapse as a single impact event where one huge asteroid hits Earth. And I think it's much more helpful to think of this as it's almost as if we're rather moving into a cloud of space debris, and we have multiple sort of meteors about to strike. And what's more complex about this is that it's harder to know where each meteor strike is going to happen and what the blast radius will be. And the case studies that I'm going to demonstrate now show the unpredictability of this and how we don't really know what the impacts will be. So Durban is a fascinating case study. There were very severe floods in April of 2019, which was the tail end of an El Nino. And then again, of course, in April 2022, which was the tail end of La Nina. And what the climate science tells us is that across the summer rainfall region of our subcontinent, El Nino will bring higher temperatures and greater drought. But that doesn't mean the region will be spared extreme rain events. You will still have these episodes, these short sort of rain bomb episodes. And certainly what happened in Durban in 2019 was one of those. That's a little meteor strike, which had very significant effects. So that is an example of inland flooding, the kind of flooding that we will see in cities wherever you have rain bomb events. It's not an example of a coastal surge. But what is interesting, and I would really urge everyone to go and look at a brilliant piece of journalism called A Perfect Storm, which looks at Durban as a case study from the 2022 floods. And it shows how incredibly complex it is when one of these rain bomb events happens. And when flooding like this happens, it hits, obviously the water is hitting a natural, the natural topography of the area. But on top of that, you've got the built environment. You also have the apartheid sort of footprint of the city, where the poorest people have usually been pushed into the most marginal areas. And with informality, people are forced to build in very high-risk areas like floodplains. And then on top of that, you've got city development plans that are often very influenced by private sector interests in the city, and this kind of perpetuates the same inequality. And then within the city, you will have river systems that will either be, that are often degraded. So the wetlands that would ordinarily absorb, like an airbag would absorb a sudden rain event, these aren't working anymore because they've been overgrown with invasive species, or they've been badly eroded, mined, maybe overgrazed. And then you've got a very, very paved surface. So instead of the water landing and trickling down slowly and seeping into the river, it just hits the top, flows off, and then you have massive flooding. And I mean, it's interesting looking at some of the climate analysis, the climate change analysis from Durban. These two events that I'm talking about, the 2019 and the 2022 floods, the flooding was extreme, but it wasn't unprecedented. What made this incredibly damaging was that these rain bombs were hitting this very specific landscape. So there's a huge amount to be learned from this, and cities, as they go forward to kind of be more resilient against these kind of flood events, have got massive challenges. You know, it's about service delivery, it's about making sure, you know, waste is removed from waterways, etc., etc. Very, very complex. There are things that we can do to be more resilient. We just have to engage with the complexity of the system and figure out where the leverage points are, and then work those leverage points.
Yeah, no, exactly, Leonie. I think you've hit the nail on the head. What everyone was speaking about when the Durban floods happened last year was, oh, clearly we have a terrible weather monitoring system. And no, not at all. Like, the South African Weather Service is world renowned. We're set with world-class standards. We knew it was happening. We knew it was coming. It wasn't necessarily unprecedented. It's just that the structures that we have in place, because of historical inequality, meant that people were already living in dangerous areas. And that's something we really need to understand now. As you said, it's one of my favorite books is Slow Violence of Climate Change. It's sort of like a slow moving thing that we need to prepare for. Coleen, you have a lot of experience in disaster management. It can be quite overwhelming for municipalities who are really struggling with funding, and who don't necessarily have experience in climate adaptation, might not even have climate literacy to understand what that means. How do we work with them in a way that's not going to be overwhelming? And also, what I think is very important, sorry, maybe slightly off what you're going to say, is we really need to co-produce knowledge with communities on the ground. South Africa has such a unique landscape. We can't adopt solutions from the global north. Indigenous communities have a lot of very vital information. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
So all I can say is ditto, ditto, ditto.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
The reason why my hair is so short is that I lose a bit of it, because working with these complex metros and cities, those are complicated spaces, right? And people are so well-meaning, but the capacities are quite limited, even in the large metros. But people are starting to write climate adaptation plans, and the C40, the compacts of mayors. I mean, people are really, I think, now trying to gear up. The problem is, how do we intersect with those, and how do we raise? It's not just government alone that can do this. It's everybody's job. So how do we draw in people who can come into the space with, you know, awareness, and people who want to make a difference? So yes, absolutely. Last week, for example, I was in Durban at a BRICS meeting, which was post-disasters from COVID. And, you know, there was a huge commitment by, you know, very high up senior officials in all the countries. And hopefully now we can try and roll some of that out. But I think the point that Leonie is making is also very interesting. Because these events now, you know, the scientists are doing a great job. The South African Weather Services is also strained with capacity issues, but we're also getting much, much better, you know, forecasts. We can really start to do these things. But as I think one of the respondents, I just noticed it on the screen, said, well, you know, you're not supposed to be living in the 1 in 100-year flood line, and yet, you know, people are. And so it's this link between how do we get the planners in particular. I've noticed it's quite hard to get the planners involved, not because they're not, you know, nice people or friendly people, but they've got real deliverables, right? They have to design cities. They have to be thinking about densification, transport networks. How do people get closer to work? Because that's why they're coming into the cities, et cetera, et cetera. And juxtaposed against all this, or layered on top of all of this, are all these now changes that are occurring with the weather and with climate. So it's an interesting space to be working with, but I think disaster risk reduction, and then the role that Leonie and others play, the journalism, the advocacy, the art, you know, the mainstreaming. I don't really like the word mainstreaming, but the, you know, how to get that message out there so that it becomes everybody's concern. And this is going to be an interesting El Nino, because as we've seen in Europe, there have been really high temperatures. The link between climate change and El Nino is not very conclusive at the moment. We're still trying to look at attribution. I'm sure Leonie can talk to this as well. Even the Durban floods, was that linked? How was it linked? Is it really a development failure of the state and planning and whatever? Why did it become a disaster? Is it because, hotels are being developed in land areas where they shouldn't be developed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So these concerns are big issues, and I think it's trying to keep pushing. I often say to my students, like pushing an elephant up the stairs. We just got to keep going because you want to give up. I tried the disaster risk reduction community in 2002, and my son always jokes. He says, one way we'll come into the old age home and you'll say, so did we finally create, robust systems? But you just got to keep on going, right? So despite all the challenges that we have, I think there's great political will, but I am concerned about the capacities and the ability for us to get some of the great policies that we have onto the ground. It's a huge. So I'm really keen to follow up with the BRICS countries as soon as I can to say, okay, now fine, you wrote some resolutions in Durban last Friday, but what the hang does this mean for people on the ground? So I'll send it back. Thanks.
No, exactly. We've had some really good questions and really good insights from people in the chat. I think something which a lot of people are wondering is individually, what can we do? People in South Africa don't necessarily have a lot of faith in our government. I think we need to work with our government, but I think there's a lot that individuals can do. So remember, as we've learned, El Nino is in South Africa the drier period. And like we saw in Cape Town in the 2015 to 2017 drought, saving water was very important. So is that something that people should be focused on? Should we have more sustainable water saving methods? Should we be stocking up? Leonie, would you like to touch up on that? Or?
So I would just like to jump in quickly to pick up on something we spoke about earlier, and then
okay. Perfect.
So, I mean, it's interesting in the sort of 20 years that I've been writing about this, I've spoken with many, many people who live in and settle in these high-risk flood areas. And they all give very logical, very reasonable reasons for why they might settle in a place where they shouldn't be living. In the dry season, it might look safe. The immediate concern is a roof over their heads tonight. These are all reasons why they might build an informal home in a high-risk area. And it really highlights the responsibility of the city and urban planning to ensure that there is adequate housing for them in the place that so, that's just one thing to remember. And also, to go back to that case study I mentioned, A Perfect Storm, that piece of journalism, what was really lovely about this piece is that it highlights an early warning system that was being test-driven in Durban, where people like Coleen were working with people within the city, with the South African Weather Service, and with people, a community living in Quarry Road in an informal settlement.
Yeah,
it was an excellent example of how this early warning system saved lives that night, the night of that very severe flood. So if cities could look to those kinds of interventions, it will be life-saving. But really, again, as Coleen was saying, it just shows the complexity of the number of different parties that have to work together, but it's possible. So I would really urge everyone to go and read that case study. It really gave me tremendous hope.
Yeah. Wait, Leonie, before you go into the next point, sorry to interrupt. Also, know the Quarry Road example, incredible. The resilience of South Africans never fails to astound me. Coleen Dardigan, sorry, I might have butchered that, from the chat, she's been making some really excellent points. And she asked, is it illegal to farm or build on a floodplain? Which is a very interesting question because a lot of government projects have sort of ignored that.
So I'm not a planner, so I'm not sure I can actually answer that. But I think, we've seen shopping centers being built in these areas. I think not so much the legality issues, but it's just the issue of the ecological infrastructure. I think Leonie made that point that, nature provides us with the very useful ways of getting rid of surplus water, et cetera, And so when we go against that, it's like nature kind of fights back in some ways, and we end up with some of these traumas. But just going back to the Quarry Road example, you know, Kathy Sutherland and their team with Sean Donaghy and others in the Durban, you know, Metro, eThekwini Metro have done an amazing job, but it takes time. They've been working with this community in Quarry Road, doing the disaster risk reduction, doing the literacy. It takes about, I don't know, I think they've been working there for about 6-7 years. And so without sounding, you know, simplistic, how does one now ramp that up? The window is closing, right? Everyone's saying, oh, we've got 1,000 days, or I don't know, a couple of years or whatever. How do we now move the gears without making people so frightened and feeling like victims that we still keep the agency? Otherwise, we're all just going to say, you know, I'll just go and have a stiff drink and wait for it all to come, you know, which is not very, very helpful. But going back to that point about the early warning, so in Geneva last 2 weeks ago when I was there working on one of their big programs, the head of the United Nations and the United Nations have called for early warning systems for all. You can Google it. And essentially in 5 years, they want every person to at least have access to getting an early warning system. And so we've had good records, like the Quarry Road example. But now how do we make that part of government's efforts to work on that, but without losing the focus on service delivery, et cetera, because I think many of us have been saying when we have these devastating events, either a drought or a flood or a heat wave or whatever, it just rolls back the development gains that we've made. And so it makes sense for us to be investing with business, with private enterprise, with academics, with citizens, with whoever we can, to try and get these early warning systems so that, you know, other countries do that for tornadoes and other things. But these are creeping phenomena like the El Nino, especially the one, you know, the droughts. So we kind of like frog in boiling water, I think the analogy is, you know, you just keep on going, you know, with the flow until it really becomes a crisis.
Yeah.
And so it's not like we don't have great policy. It's not like we don't have, you know, early warning and et cetera, et cetera. But what is strange for us as scientists is, why is there such a, I don't know, is the word cognitive dissonance, or this disconnection that we can't seem to get it working within the systems that are already there, the regulatory systems and everything. And I think it comes back to Leonie's point, and what we've been trying to do in the city of Johannesburg is we have to co-design these things. It sounds very blah, 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 but we really have to work with multiple citizens. We're all citizens. And citizen science, local perspectives, you made the point, Julia, in indigenous or local knowledge systems. How do we now really put this onto the table through education, through outreach, advocacy, journalism, whatever we can, and even getting, you know, hip hop and getting, you know, social media, working with young people. I've been working with young people, the youth, and it's amazing how entrepreneurial they are, which can turn into skills development and, you know, create jobs. And so, you know, I don't think it's just only El Nino and, oh my God, we're going to be hit by this. What do we do? I think it opens, it kind of is a lever that we can kind of pull down on and really move forward with the country on that. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, no, but incredible response. I agree with everything. Just for the audience, Quarry Road is an informal settlement in Joubert that was situated along a river and on a floodplain, and there's about 1,000 people living there, and not one life was lost during the Durban floods because they had co-produced disaster risk management solutions years, as you said before. So when those floods happened, they had WhatsApp groups, they were communicating on the ground with people, they got a system, and everyone got out safely, even though they were in a very high-risk area. So sometimes we're a bit doom and gloom in South Africa, and if our government sucks and blah, 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 but actually there are some good examples. And Kathy Sutherland from UKZN, University of KwaZulu-Natal, and some of the people from the local government did an incredible work there. It's a great example. And yeah, I think sometimes we need to be, I don't know if optimistic is the right word, but it's very easy to be negative. It's very comfortable to be negative, I think. And we need to realize that we have a lot of resilient and incredibly smart people in South Africa. Leonie, maybe, sorry, I interrupted you earlier. If you'd like to carry on with that. Sorry, there's so much to speak about. The chat People are very smart in the chat. But Laura Frank has asked, perhaps Leonie could respond to this. Laura asked, how are cities preparing health facilities for heat waves? Heat waves not necessarily linked to El Nino, but heat waves, as we know, under climate change scenario will become more intense and more frequent. So yeah, maybe we can just chat about health facilities in general, because drought is obviously going to affect people's health.
So this is a great question, and it ties into something else that I wanted to say. So I'm going to package the two of them together. Starting with Coleen's reflection on having hope and agency, because I must tell you that after 20 years of writing about this, the last few years have taken a huge toll on my own mental health, just feeling so overwhelmed. And I'm writing a book about it at the moment. I hope it'll be a way of exorcising some of the anxiety. But the most important thing, the single most important or most asked question whenever I speak on climate change is, what can I as an individual do? And I'm beginning to see the answers. And in this context, what we're talking about today, someone like, it's Yuval Noah Harari. He says, from a citizen's perspective, one of the most potent things you can do is either start a movement or join a movement. Because whether we're talking about, tackling fossil fuels, or whether we're talking about helping communities deal with these climate shocks.
I think Leonie broke up.
It's extraordinary in terms of moving it. Oh boy, am I back?
Oh, sorry, you're back.
Can
you hear me? That was embarrassing for me. You immediately came back. So you're all good.
If you look at a number of really terrible extreme events, all of which will have a climate change tail, extreme fires in Neisner, extreme flooding in Durban, extreme drought in parts of the Eastern Cape. The gift of the givers have been there, offering humanitarian aid. An organization like that has got the infrastructure in place. They know how to deliver in an emergency. So if we're sitting at home, we can support organizations like that, with money, whatever, donations. That really is a way for an individual to have a sense of agency. It's really important. The issue of heat waves, such an important thing, which is really not on the radar. And I mean, for me, one of the single most important things that cities can do right now is to start planting trees, particularly in informal settlements. I know that it's not necessarily an easy thing to do because you need community buy-in. The trees need to be looked after. But if you have green belts in these urban hubs that are going to be hammered by heat waves. I mean, you just need to imagine what it's like if you're an elderly person with a cardiac frailty or respiratory issue, or if you're a young child. These are the people most vulnerable during a heat wave. Heat waves are definitely going to hit us harder and faster. I mean, if you look at what's been happening in Europe in the past summer, this is guaranteed for us in the next while. Now, imagine that you're living in an informal structure, tin roof over your head, no insulation, you don't have any refrigeration at home, you can't just take out some iced water and cool yourself down. The number of heat-related deaths is going to dramatically increase. And of course, these are often not directly attributed to climate change or an extreme event, because the cause of death will be listed as heart attack, when in fact it's a heat-induced heart attack. And so it's really difficult to go into an informal settlement where you have so many exposed homes and exposed individuals. But if there's any way that you can start to reduce that heat island effect, and of course planting trees is a brilliant way to do that. So as citizens, we can work across these different networks to find ways to bring trees and support trees in these communities, so that, summers of tomorrow will not be as devastating for people living in those homes.
Well, Leonie, honestly, someone has made like a very excellent point even before you brought that up. I feel like everyone in the chat was like an A student at school or something. Everyone's really smart. So Max Jordan asked, what is the role of urban design, particularly lack of open spaces or green belts in urban centers? Why does high density residential areas not make provision for this? Which is interesting.
Can I come in quickly?
Yeah. Do you want to respond?
Maybe just quickly coming on the tail of what Leonie was saying about the heat waves. So we're working quite a lot on that in our unit, and there is the, Department of Health. There is a heat strategy, heat and health at the, the international levels. We're working on health more in general, not only heat. And then also down on the ground, people are starting to put some policies in place. But I think the biggest problem for me is that we got to move much, much faster. So, we've been talking about these things, we put the policy in place, and then getting it onto the ground where people can actually work. So students of mine have done some assessments, and the tragedy is that in particular certain parts of Gauteng, I won't name them because I don't want to shame them, and it's not really people's fault, but people who are working in the health sections in the cities, it's not necessarily their key performance area at the moment. It's not integrated systemically into a system that they will get rewarded for. And so people are now starting to say, oh gosh, this is something that I should be doing, but it's not part of my KPA. So how do I now start doing this? So I think we need to be thinking about that sort of structuring of how we reward people for doing this work. But coming to the urban design sets of issues. I'm not an expert in this, but I was listening to, there's an urban festival, I think, happening soon in Durban, I think it is. And there, they draw in artists and urban thinkers, and I've been working with some artists as well. And there's lots of interesting ideas that people are bringing in to reconfigure and rethink creatively our cities, rather than, I heard some people say, we don't need new cities, because there is a bit of a move on that in some parts of Gauteng. Rather, let's just make the cities that we've got work better. So I think that's the point. How do we retrofit? How do we build, design? And then of course we've got the electricity crisis. So, oh my gosh, everyone's now trying to link all these things together, and it's hectic. And then the complex informalities that Leonie spoke about. I mean, what does this mean for really, I actually read a very interesting piece yesterday. It said, it's not only the landscape that needs attention, it's the lifescape. How do people's lives, whether they're rich or poor, what does El Niño mean? Not just what it does to the land, which it makes agriculture difficult, et cetera, but what does it mean to us as our lives on a daily basis? And I think if we can start really coming out of COVID and really looking at some of these things from a humane perspective, we might start to really just dive in and roll up our sleeves and just take some of these things forward.
Agreed. And what I wanted to mention earlier when Leonie spoke about trees, which Jenny Peterson has said, indigenous trees that have adapted to the soil types and climates of the specific region, as opposed to thirsty, invasive, non-indigenous species. So yes, very true. Something that a lot of companies who like to greenwash will be like, oh, we've done this many emissions, we'll plant 100 trees. We have to be very cognizant in South Africa that has lots of grasslands and savannas. We need to be planting indigenous trees or trees that are not going to mess up the biodiversity. But agreed, green belts, really just shade. I completely imagine if you go into some of these settlements, it's so dry, it's so hot, just without any shade. As simple as that. And then, like you said, you're basically cooking inside this thing. But it's not just that. It's like you said, whether you're rich or poor. Unfortunately, it seems that the more money you have, the more you can escape the impacts of climate change. But everyone is going to be affected. We all actually do need to care, and hopefully, people are also compassionate and care about other people. But yeah, Leonie, what I also wanted to ask you. Was a lot of people were mentioning the situation that's happening in Libya. Do you have any knowledge about that you would like to bring in?
So, I mean, that Libya so you have this extreme rain event. It hits infrastructure, these dams that are probably, it sounds like they weren't well enough maintained. The crisis management, as the dams got fuller, it looks like that wasn't in place. This is, I mean, when I saw the headlines, I just got a chill down my spine, because I thought how perfectly that event demonstrates the kind of vulnerability that we're going to face. It's not a single rain event. It's the single rain event happening on top of institutional capacity, weak infrastructure. The thought of that number of people being washed out to sea is just harrowing. And, you know, a lot of people say, well, why wasn't the city prepared? Why wasn't there an early warning system in place? I don't think there's a single city out there that is prepared for the extreme events that we're starting to see hit us now. These kind of events are off the charts, really off the charts. And, you know, there's, I think what I find distressing working as a writer on the African continent is how many of these places are so invisible from the global discourse. You know, we've seen the headlines from the global north just full of extreme events over the past year. These extreme events have been hitting Southern Africa and parts of Africa for years, and they're not reported on because we just don't have boots on the ground. And by that, I mean we don't have journalists on the ground. In many areas, we don't have civil society or researchers. So we're not getting that first line of history reporting that shows, I mean, quite a few of the stories I've done in the last few years have been of the terrible impacts of extreme droughts, extreme flooding, extreme cyclones in parts of the world that are almost invisible from the global discourse. So I think the Libya story, I mean, it's just absolutely chilling, and we're going to see so much more of this happening. Exactly. I would like, if there's time, to talk about the Mozambique case, but I also, you know, I see that the conversation has evolved in a direction which I think is quite interesting. But I do want to bring to everyone's attention a brilliant piece of research done by the African Climate Mobility Initiative, which very recently showed the extent to which climate is going to accelerate human mobility around the continent, this movement between the hinterland and the cities. And cities, of course, you know, Africa is urbanizing very, very quickly. So a lot of these development challenges are going to be concentrated in cities, a lot of movement within cities, between cities. And it does show that cities are these hubs for solutions, but also for crisis, as we saw in Libya. So have a look at its voices from the front lines. I think the tech team is going to share that link with you. But really brilliant resource, yeah.
No, very true. Thank you, Leonie. The link to that is in the chat. And sorry, this question has gotten a lot of upvotes, so I just want to mention it. Coleen, this I think will definitely be for you. Amanda Espag asks, what is the extent of the effects of climate change in El Niño, especially concerning wildfires in South Africa?
So that's a tough one. I know there are people who do working for with fires, etc., etc. Again, I'm not sure about El Niño studies that have been done, which link, you know, extreme drought periods like we've had in the past and wildfires.
But maybe just in general.
So I mean, it kind of, you know, makes sense that if you're having, especially couple of months, you're having a rainfall season that isn't bringing rain, and then you're having the drying out of the vegetation, etc., and then something sparks, either, you know, lightning, or maybe it's arson or whatever. Someone sparks a wildfire. It's not kind of really rocket science that, you know, if the vegetation is really dry, it'll start catching and spread. But I think the forestry organizations, there are many people who are trying to gear up around that, you know, with fire breaks, and how do we, again, make communities take ownership and alerts that can be done, etc., etc. But if whoever posted that question is interested, I can definitely try and find out. But yeah, I mean, as I said, it's kind of common sense, I think, some of the issues. The problem is that what we're seeing, if we look at the European and the North American and others, and Canadians and Greece, etc., etc. Some of these issues, you know, once the heat just is relentless, if it keeps on, so it's not even almost a heat wave, it's just a heat season, because you don't get any break, then you really are starting to gear up for some, I think, really nasty surprises. But I wanted to add on to Leonie's comment, and maybe for the participants who are taking part in this webinar, the other thing that is, it's not only that the things are off the charts now, we're really starting to see temperatures right off the charts, you know, in historical period, but it's this problem of these back-on-back events. So you're going from drought, flood, heat wave. It's just like relentless, right? In the past, we used to have a bit of a break to catch our breath. And in a way, it was problematic because we would kind of say, oh, well, thank God that's gone now. We'll, let's back to business as usual. And unfortunately, we can't be doing that anymore. Our system has got to be ramped up to such a degree that we need to be agile. And how do you maintain flexibility and agility in a South African context with all the other pressing challenges? We're really taking strain, but we make plans in South Africa, as we're known for. We're strong in rugby. We can do this, if we all stand together. But it's this, I really do want to leave people with this notion that, don't think if the El Nino comes and goes and then we're back to kind of nice weather next year or whatever, that, it's passed for a while. Because I think we've got to be constantly on the alert. And that's why we need everyone on working together on this. And I think it can be a wonderful, many people are now with the just transition that the Presidential Climate Commission is doing, the job situation, the green skills. We need the creative thinkers to come and turn this into wonderful opportunities rather than just, oh my God, here we go again, we're all victims and what can we do? Oh, it's awful. I really think we should be turning this into some opportunities. And, I have great fun with my students at university because they're young, much younger than me, thank God. And they're much more adept on social media. They're much more creative. They're listening to blogs. They're coming forward. But where's that voice getting into the government circles? And so now we're starting to work with the City of Johannesburg to have youth coming in with skill summits and things like that. It's so exciting to listen to these young people and then also the elderly, sort of my age category. We've got knowledge still that we can draw back in.
Of course, yeah.
So people are taking, I think in eThekwini, engineers are being called back in to say you've got a ton of knowledge. So it's everybody that should be coming in. And it's exciting. I mean, it gives you reason to get up in the morning.
No, it is. And I think this is the whole thing with climate change. And obviously, you guys have worked in the industry for decades. I've been in it for about 2.5 years. But it's one of those things where people get compassion fatigue because it's not like a one thing event where it happens and then it's over and we can move on. It's something that's getting worse and worse. How do we keep the momentum up? I think for me, it's less about blaming people for drinking with a plastic straw and more about coming together and really trying to change the system. Otherwise, it's like trying to hold a clock to a tap, nothing's going to properly be resolved. Leonie, you had your hand up earlier. Was there something you wanted to add?
Well, I mean, there's a lot we could say about the whole wildfire thing. I just wanted to quickly say that, what Coleen is saying about, it's very intuitive what is happening with El Nino, La Nina, and wildfires. I mean, in La Nina events, you might have more vegetation growing because you've got lots of rain in certain parts. El Nino comes along, dries it all out. There's more fuel load for the fire. I don't want to take up too much more time speaking about wildfires, but there's a very strong link between degraded environments, like with alien invasive species, drought cycles, flood cycles, and then the climate driving the increase in the risk of fire weather, which then goes hand in hand with these human-caused ignition events. So yes, there's a whole webinar just in that. But yeah, let's move on to maybe something else as we wrap up.
I wondered if, sorry, can I?
Can you go, yeah?
Sorry, I hope I'm not being too rude here.
Not at all.
I just wanted to pick up on Leonie's point about the anxiety that's being created. So there was a recent seminar with some very forward-thinking neuroscientists, actually, and people working on cognitive and contemplative ways of thinking. Leonie, I can share with you the webinar. It was amazing. And the whole thing focused around this notion of eco-anxiety. And someone said to me, well, people who are living in informal settlements, they're anxious anyway, because life, it's not 100% great. But then the notion of this eco-anxiety is really real. And if you talk to young people in particular, the despair of like, what world are we inheriting, So Leonie, I'd be very keen to hear about your book coming out, because I think that's another hidden story that people are just kind of can't cope to think now of another stressor coming into our lives when we have no electricity, we're struggling with, traffic and poverty and all these issues. But this eco-anxiety, I think, is unfortunately going to start growing, and we really need to be empathetic and sympathetic about how we handle that with our psychology friends, but also religious, spiritual leaders, contemplative thinkers. It's going to take the wisdom of a number of people to help us get through this, unfortunately. But thank
100%. Yeah, I just wanted to say, it's so hard when I say, oh, I'm Julia, I'm a climate journalist, and I'm like, and a biodiversity journalist, and politics, and human rights, because it's all interlinked. It's not like it's all separate. And when people say, it's a huge thing with, I've spoken to some climate youth activists who go into informal settlements, and it's like, well, they have other issues, more like pressing issues to deal with, like they have to look after their siblings, and they have to figure out how to cook food when they don't have electricity. So why should they be caring about climate change, which is like a white people's issue? But it's actually not, because it affects literally all aspects of life. And that's why I think the climate crisis is the most pressing issue humans face today. Anyway, Leonie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so I mean, this is at risk of being very vulnerable and kind of really putting my cards on the table, but this is essentially what this book is about. I had to take myself to hospital twice in the past year with life-threatening depression because of the absolute overwhelm of this climate thing. Realizing, I'm 50 now, I've got 10 more years to be effective. We're told we've got 10 more years to reverse this or to slow the crisis. That's 10 birthdays. It's 134 moons. And the existential overwhelm of that just absolutely took me out of the knees. So the reason I'm mentioning this and why I'm writing this book is because this is a part of the climate part of the climate crisis we're not talking about. And the final chapter of this book is about what we do alongside one another to help each other through these crises, because we have a mental health collapse coming our way. And we have these two tensions. People living in poverty are dealing with this kind of anxiety every single day. And then there are people that are now starting to think about the chronic long-term stress of realizing our future is so terrifying and uncertain. And there are so many things that we can draw on. I mean, we've got thousands of years of contemplative practice. We've got emerging neuroscience. We know exactly how to deal with this stuff. We just need to pull together and do it. So if I could just find a few months of sabbatical to finish the book, but this book feels like the most important thing I've ever written.
I think it might be. Thank you so much for sharing that, Leonie, and being vulnerable. I think vulnerability is one of the best ways to cut through compassion fatigue. People often ask me if I get depressed being a journalist or a climate journalist, and well, I'm only 2 years in, so let's see. But I think what has helped me and other people is that it's going to happen whether I ignore it or not, and at least I'm doing something. And I think that's what we all need to realize, is that ignorance, first of all, is a privilege not everyone can afford, and it's actually very harmful. So, like you said, either start a movement or join a movement. And I love that in this chat, everyone seems to be very active, and I hope that they can speak to their friends who aren't as active, so we don't just live in an echo chamber. So we have about 9 minutes left. I'm gonna maybe take some questions, but Coleen, is there, in terms of going forward, in terms of planning, you told me that during the BRICS conference, there was a specialized conference happening in Durban with local government and the BRICS countries, and they've created a resolution. Would you like to speak a bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, it was a really interesting conference. So it wasn't part of the main big BRICS that was in Sandton, but it was a high level conference with officials from the city, DDGs, ministers, etc., Kochta, National Disaster Management Center, etc., etc. And I was very privileged to lead a panel, and the whole idea was for us to reflectively and reflexively think about post-COVID. What does it mean for economic and social disaster risk reduction approaches? So it wasn't just only climate, but early warning systems came out huge, because I think UN resolutions are now starting to filter down. But one of the things that, it was lovely to also see some old colleagues from the National Disaster Management Center who, we've all been around the same mountain for many, many years. The resolution I have not yet seen, but one of the things I suggested to you, Julia, and maybe also Leonie can help us, I've already phoned the National Disaster Management Center and said, I want a meeting with the top people now, because we chatted over tea and snacks and whatever, but now that's not enough. So now what does this really mean on the ground? Because again, we have these great meetings. We've got great intellectuals, great activists, great whatevers. But when it comes to implementing and carrying these things sustainably into the future, we seem to get, quite naturally, I suppose, we get diverted by other things that are coming at us from all sides. And this one I definitely want to follow up, because it is a commitment made that everyone should get early warning systems. But then also, what are the lessons learned? What are we failing? Where are the gaps? What are we not doing? How can we get the planners involved? How can we get the architects, the artists, the video experts, the rap artists? I don't know. There's a whole gamut of things that we could be putting on the table so that we open up this discussion rather than keep it like scientific, which I think is problematic. I don't think science is not going to get us through this alone. Yeah, it's great to have early warning and forecasting and all that. And I'm a scientist, I have to battle for my team, but it's not enough. We need other approaches, cognitive thinking, spiritual thinking, deep philosophy thinking, which is, I think, very much a hard science. So maybe to end, I would suggest to people, just keep informed, keep listening, keep learning, and then phoning people, phone us at the university, at the Global Change Institute, and say, how can I play a role? Can I come and join you? Because we need every hand and set of feet on the deck to really keep us. So I hope El Nino is not too bad and that it doesn't exacerbate possible heat waves, but at least we're starting to talk now about this. I've been in this game for a long, long time, and I think Leonie as well. And in the beginning, it was just a few of us, people thought we were crazy, I think. But now there's a lot of people in the space. So we now really need to collectively do something. But thank you very much for this chance to share and be part of this wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Well, Coleen, it's been honestly a huge privilege for me. I've annoyed Coleen many times, asking her to explain complex climate things to me for articles. I always feel so special because I get to speak to such smart scientists for free for my job, and they get to explain things. It's like in the past 2 years, I feel like I've gone and done a master's degree just by being a climate journalist, because I've learned so much. But exactly, and I agree with everything you said. And I think a big thing that we're all thinking of, and M Black in the chat asked, how do we make 2024 a climate justice election? So I think as citizens, we're all thinking the next big thing is the elections. For me, Leonie, I'd like you to respond maybe to that question, but it's a tough one, because sometimes also as a journalist, people like to say to me, oh, like climate change has become politicized. I mean, it kind of has to be politicized in a way, but you need to realize who has more of a vested interest, the government and the politicians and the companies who have money in the existing system and existing oil and gas companies, or people who are trying to push for a lower carbon scenario. It's just, But anyway, Leonie, I feel like you'll have some thoughts on that. How do we make 2024 a climate justice election? And then we have 5 minutes left, so if you have any final thoughts. Oh, and also everyone is giving you tons of support in the chat. That is what I love about the climate community, and people are resonating a lot about their eco-anxiety, just sort of realizing that's what they have. So agreed. We've all been there.
So there are so many ways that one could answer the question that you've just put, and I think I just want to use this opportunity to answer in a specific way. Again, over the years, everyone asks me, what can I do? And the important thing is, none of us can do everything. We have to understand the system, which is very political. There's no ways you can get around that. If you look at a political economy perspective, who has power in the system, who doesn't, who's profiting, who isn't. But if we can understand where our leverage point is in that system, and from my perspective, I'm a storyteller. So from, Coleen, interestingly enough, keeps mentioning rap artists, etc., etc. What I just shared a link with you a few moments ago, and it's a talk I gave at the Two Oceans Aquarium, but it tries to nail down precisely what I mean. Storytelling is one of humanity's oldest technologies. We have been telling stories for 200,000 years. This is how we create social cohesion, how we agree around social norms. This is how we shift political discourse. And I don't mean storytelling just as, a writer. We are all storytellers, whether we are taking photographs, whether we are a climate scientist writing an abstract on a paper, whether we are, whatever we're doing, we are storytelling. And if we can figure out how to shift the public discourse constantly by bringing the story in, we can start to leverage. And that's how 2024 becomes a climate issue. We just have to keep talking. And if I think of how much the discourse has shifted in the past 20 years, not nearly enough. But I think we're reaching a tipping point. I honestly do. And that is why I still get out of bed every day, because I have conversations like this where I start to see things change. So storytelling.
Yes, I completely agree. It's the way to cut through compassion fatigue for me. Realizing that the human experience means that we've all experienced something else that someone else has, which is what I'm seeing in the chat. It's actually very beautiful. People are saying this has really resonated with them, and keep on fighting, and being part of this community is really helping them get through, which is really lovely. And I mean, as I said, I'm only 25, so, half the life experience, but it really motivates me to keep going and to not feel despondent, which I think all South Africans, we need to think about, because I know we can get very despondent, but on the other hand, we're some of the most resilient, incredible thinkers out there. And it's kind of an exciting time, like you said, Coleen. There's a lot of solutions that can happen, and also, there's only 1 minute left, so no, there's so much to say. I wish I could go on forever, but just like to say thank you, everyone, all the audience members, for tuning in. I've loved all the comments. I wish we could have gotten through all the questions. We could speak for maybe 4 hours on this. And thank you so much for joining. And thank you. This is my first webinar. You've made it such a joy. And thank you so much, Leonie and Coleen, for giving us an hour of your time. And thank you for all the work you do. We need people like you. And it also makes me want to get out of bed in the morning. This discussion has really also rejuvenated me. It's been so lovely. So thank you guys so much. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And thank you for the support.